Hi everyone, can you all hear me okay? So, most of you know who I am, but some of you don't. And I'm Alison, Pat and Steve's daughter. Even though I haven't met all of you, it's lovely to know that Dad meant something to each and every one of you, and we're honoured to have you all here today. Sadly, there are a few of Dad's closest friends who are not able to join us. He is friends of more than 50 years, Frank Hicks, Peter Jackson and Bernie Lyons, Andrew King from his old Morwell days, Paul and Sue Waller, long-time camping friends, and Anthony Mignani, a dear friend who was there with Mum at the hospital right until the end. I know they all send their love to us all. We want to celebrate today the life of an amazing man that we all knew and admired. A man who lived much longer than he ever expected, and who touched so many people's lives, leaving an impact and legacy far greater than he ever could have imagined. Some wonderful people are going to follow me with their own memories of Dad, covering in more detail some of the larger parts of his life, and it was a very big life. To set the stage for this, I'd like to give you all an overview of the remarkable life that he lived. The story of Dad's life reads like a boy's own adventure. He grew up on a solid diet of swallows and Amazons, Hornblower, wizard comics, and boys' own adventure books, filling his heart with a quest for adventures. Born in Walsall to Bob and Molly Craddock, he grew up in a very dingy part of England's Midlands, in very humble surroundings. In this mining town, most young boys were destined to work down to pit, but his parents were determined he would avoid this fate, always encouraging him to believe that he could do anything. In 1951, when he was 8 years old, he and his parents migrated to Australia as 10-pound Poms, excited to pursue a new life in a country abundant with promise and opportunity. After 3 months at sea, they docked in Fremantle in Western Australia, where the sight of a bountiful fresh fruit and vegetable store actually moved them to tears. They settled in Seaford, near Frankston, and shortly after arriving realised that Dad was suffering from polio. Following surgery on his legs and feet, he slowly learned to walk again. But although his legs were always a bit wonky, throughout his life, he literally took this in his stride, determined never to let it hold him back. He joined the Sea Scouts, and although his involvement with them was relatively brief, he developed a profound love of the sea and sailing, and proudly kept his hat all these years. His sisters Anne and Julia, who are sadly unable to join us from Queensland today, were born a few years later, and his grandmother emigrated to join them in Seaford. Sadly, his mother, who also had Marfan syndrome, died at home with Dad at the age of 40 when he was just 16 years old. Dad's father, Bob, was a very keen climber, and having done some scrambling, as it was called, in Wales, became one of the original members of the Victorian Climbing Club. A short and rotund figure next to Dad's lean and lanky frame, they would have made an amusing silhouette to the casual observer as they pursued their outdoor adventures. It was through the VCC and the Melbourne University Mountaineering Club that Dad met Greg and Alan Lovejoy, Pete and Fran Smith, Frank and Jan Hicks, Bernie Lyons, John and Kay Hunt, Jeff Shaw, who were to become some of his closest and longest standing friends. But Pete Smith will share more with you about those early climbing years, so I won't do that now. Arapiles was an iconic part of our life for many years. As a child, I thought nothing of scaling great heights, fearless and secure at the end of Dad's rope. If I close my eyes, I can still smell the pine needles of the camping ground at the foot of the cliff, and feel that warm, rough rock under my palms, and hear the faint clink and call of distant climbers echoing through the valley. Dad first taught me, and I think also Damien, to drive at Arapiles, sitting on a coiled climbing rope so I could sit over the steering wheel, and standing on the pedals. I loved the call, "Let's go and get firewood," as it meant I would be allowed to drive the car while others piled wood in the open boot. But let's go back to 1965, where Dad was working as a teacher at Morwell Tech with his great friends Barry Higgins, Rick Begg and Andrew King. We'll hear more about the shenanigans that they got up to from Andrew's son Ashley shortly. A teacher from the high school caught his eye. Who wouldn't have fallen in love with her? I'm not going to spoil that story though, as Mum is going to share more about it with you. Suffice it to say, they were married in 1966, and that was the beginning of a love story that lasted a lifetime. In 1968, when Dad was just 25, tragedy struck again. His father, Bob, was killed in a terrible car accident on the road not far from Arapiles. A plaque was mounted in Bob's memory on the rock at the foot of Bob's favourite climb, Diapason. I came along in 1970, and by this time we were living in a terrace house in Brunswick, which we shared with our great friends, Rick and Jane Begg. It was right next to the railway line, and I remember paintings on the walls were never straight, because with every passing train they would rattle off at an angle. I still have OCD to this day because of that. In 1973, Dad became the first person in his family to get a university degree, fulfilling one of his parents' great dreams for him. It was not plain sailing, however. In those days, in order to pass an arts degree, you were required to pass a language. He first tried French, but failed that. Then Indonesian, which he also failed, before attempting and failing German. Finally, they dropped the rule and allowed him to pass. He was very proud that I followed in his footsteps at Monash in 1992. Part of the reason he was struggling to pass the languages was that he spent all the spare time he was meant to be studying building Scarab, our Hood 23 sailing yacht in the backyard in Brunswick. While trains were stopped at the level crossing, passengers on their daily commute would lean out the windows and chat with him about the build progress. The boat was launched in 1972 and moored at Hastings. We began spending almost every weekend sailing around Western Port Bay and to Tasmania every Christmas. We stopped at various Bass Strait islands, becoming very familiar with Flinders Island, where Mount Killiecrankie would later feature as a climbing destination. We also took part in yacht racing. Sorry, I read that one. And our friend John Martin will talk more about this. I don't remember much about it, other than sticking my head up through the hatch to ask, "Are we winning?" Only to be told, "Alison, get below!" I really have to credit my father for giving me this childhood love of sailing and beautiful wooden boats, because in my late 20s, I ran away to sea, where I met Andy, a classic yacht sailor, who is now my husband. It seems impossible to imagine that there was room in our lives for anything more, but we also spent a great deal of time camping and bushwalking. We camped every Easter at the Snowy River, kayaking by day and telling tall stories and singing around the bonfire by night. I'm sure Pete Smith, Damien and Michael will share more stories about this. In the meantime, Dad's undying love of the great outdoors saw us bushwalking all over Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania and New Zealand. This in turn led to cross-country skiing, seen by Dad as a way of extending the adventure into a new dimension. Ever the environmentalist, Dad followed the Paddy Palin maxim, take nothing but photographs, leave nothing but footprints. His passion for the environment continued long into his later years as a member of the Barwon Heads Coast Committee, lobbying to retain the natural integrity of the local area. He was always an activist. Back in the 70s, as a 6'2" teacher with a booming voice and commanding presence, he was a staunch unionist, lefty, and supporter of the underdog. This led him to form lifelong friendships at Jordanville Tech with the likes of Heather Lacey, John and Jelly Sutton, and Anthony Mignani, and later at Boronia Heights Secondary College, Charles and Jan Smith, with all of whom he always enjoyed spirited discussions and putting the world to rights. His activism taught me to challenge the status quo, to always ask why, and to wonder, is there a better way? Throughout his life, he wrote letters to The Age, the ABC, members of Parliament and local government, giving his take on current affairs and his opinion on matters of administration. After the Kenny Everett character, Angry of Mayfair, we nicknamed him Angry of Ashwood, and later, Belligerent of Barwon Heads, although he never actually used those nom de plumes. I wish he had. He was always an early adopter of new technology. In 1977, he surprised Mum and I by bringing home a colour TV so we could watch the Queen's Silver Jubilee in all its glory. As you probably know, from the very beginning, he was a staunch supporter of all things Apple, something he has passed on, I believe, to many of you as well. He loved what Apple stood for. It was more than just the practical aspect of the computer. It was the irreverent underdog, the simple, user-friendly and aesthetically beautiful interface. Generous to a fault, Dad would often hand on older versions of Mac equipment to others, giving him a philanthropic justification for upgrading to the latest model. Having had to work for everything he had in life, Dad instilled in me a very strong work ethic. I had 20 cents a week pocket money from a very young age and used to put soft toys on lay-by at the Hastings op shop, steadfastly paying them off week by week until I got to take these treasured items home. When I wanted a Barbie townhouse rather than buy me a plastic pink monstrosity, he brought home a second-hand wooden cupboard that we converted together into a scale model of our Brunswick Street terrace house, complete with handmade cardboard furniture. We also created and landscaped a Hornby model train set together. When my best friend at primary school, Catherine Windus, inducted me into the cult of Collingwood, I would accompany her and her father Keith on Saturdays to watch our Mighty Pies play at Victoria Park. Before I could have an official duffel coat, scarf and hat, Dad made me learn every single player's name, game statistics and my 6 times tables, forwards and backwards, off by heart before I was allowed any of these expensive items. He was nothing if not steadfast in his values: integrity, fairness, equality, and empathy. A staunch feminist, he passionately encouraged me to believe that girls can do anything, to the point that I still find sexism baffling when I encounter it today. Always direct, sometimes a little bit too direct. He never flattered you or told you what you wanted to hear. His opinion was always 100% genuine, so you knew that when he said something was good, he really meant it. His lifelong love of reading and writing spawned hours of discussion with so many of you. He is one of the few people you ever meet in life who's actually read every single book on their bookshelves, and he has a lot of bookshelves. He would offer personalised reading suggestions to friends with a lifetime of conversations sparked by the simple question, "What are you reading?" Like his mother, he often wrote to authors who, to his great delight, often wrote back. In 2015, he started a book review blog called Shelf Life and was thrilled to find readers enjoying it all over the world. It was writing that initially provided his escape from teaching when he founded Penfolk Publishing in 1987. Heather Lacey will talk more about this, but as an editor, he was skillfully ruthless, a brutal slayer of the needless adjective. Among other writing tricks, he taught me to always remove the word that, and was the enemy of any prose deemed too flowery. He probably would have hated a lot of this speech. The sale of Penfolk marked the beginning of a new chapter in Mum and Dad's lives, with the move down to Barwon Heads, having been introduced to the charms of this sleepy seaside village by Anthony Mignani and Jenny Robinson. They soon made many more wonderful friends, and Dad became president of the Barwon Heads Association and later a member of the Barwon Coast Committee. The Time and Tide column that he wrote for several years in Talking Heads magazine provides a fascinating insight into the town's transition to one of Victoria's most sought-after seaside destinations. He very much enjoyed discussing this with the community and weaving their perspectives into his articles. With me living in France, Dad was thrilled to achieve another lifelong dream, to go barging along the Canal du Midi in the Camargue. With our dear friends Terry and Vicky, they barged through France in 2007 and 2011, popping in to see me on their travels. Because he could be quite outspoken, some people might be surprised to hear that Dad was actually very sentimental. A passionate film buff, during moving moments, one might hear a loud sniff and turn in surprise to find him dabbing his eyes and blowing his nose with a big blue handkerchief. He pretended to hate cats, but would absent-mindedly stroke them as they sat on his lap. He spent years trying to convince people he was indifferent to dogs, but Huey and Gracie, his two beloved whippets, succeeded in proving this to be utter rubbish. His eye specialist once called him a polymath, as he was knowledgeable on such a wide range of topics. You may not know he was actually a skilled artist, illustrating his travel journals with beautiful pen and ink drawings, and in fact several of the early climbing guides feature his pictures of crags and their routes. His fascination with wooden yachts saw him build various watercraft in his garage, and he always enjoyed making wooden furniture. Many of you have enjoyed his home-baked bread, a hobby he took up after teaching and enthusiastically developed for the rest of his life. Believe it or not, some hobbies actually were beyond him. His interest in model aeroplanes waned swiftly when he spent more time repairing them after crashing them than he did actually flying them. And his two attempts to build model sailing yachts were foiled by lack of patience, not to mention his inability to read the Italian instructions. I clearly could talk about him for hours, but so many others want to share their stories with you. Beyond everything else, I will remember Dad for his steely grit, his tenacity and determination, his passion and enthusiasm for all subjects he found fascinating, and his curiosity and interest in the wider world and in other people. Last week, I received an incredible message from one of the paramedics who tended to Dad on that final trip to hospital. It turns out he recognised Dad's name and knew immediately who he was. He wrote, "I'm a climber, and to have climbing royalty in my ambulance was great." Even though your dad was in pain, his eyes lit up when we talked about Arapalis. It was a humbling experience to meet him. Although it's heartbreaking that I couldn't be there, it's so comforting to know that in his final hours, Dad was not only still making new friends, but also that he was treated with such dignity, respect, and appreciation of the intrepid climber that he once was. It was incredibly fitting then that although there was no time to bring his boots to the hospital, we did our best to fulfill his final wish as he was cremated with his trusty old climbing boots on. Thank you. So now I'd like to ask my Uncle Neil to come up and say some words, otherwise known as Uncle Neil.
What a hard act to follow. Alison is proof positive of the great father that Steve was. I'm not worthy. Anyway, I won't take too much of your time. I just want to read a couple of things. Firstly, from my sister Fiona and her husband Phil, who would have liked to have been here, but they're presently in Tasmania at the moment. So she sent just a very short notice. Dear Steve, thanks for the company and the laughs whenever we met. Thank you for looking after Patsy. We know you did your best under very difficult circumstances, and we are glad for you that there is no more pain, as we all are, and hope that you are in a happy place. We are so sorry we cannot be with you all today, but rest assured we are there in spirit. And to Patsy and Alison, our thoughts and deepest condolences are with you both. Looking forward to seeing you soon. Lots of love, Fiona and Phil. Anyway, I'm going to have to replace the microphone if I keep blubbing. Okay, I kind of made a shorter, sweeter version of this, just one moment. Steve inspired me also to be an Apple aficionado, so here I am. a speech on the iPhone. I won't take up too much of your time. A lot of good people are here today. We'll talk about Steve's long battle with Marfan's syndrome, his bravery and tenacity, his strength. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And Steve lived that, and Patsy too. And they cared for each other, along with many fine friends and family here today. But just keeping things on a bit of a lighter note, when my sister Fiona and I were young, and Alison was a very tiny tot, Steve and Patsy took it upon themselves to take Fiona and I out into the Australian outdoors, something we had read about in books, but not experienced for ourselves. And so for many years we were taken, sometimes willingly, canoeing at Wilson's Prom, sailing on Western Port Bay, and camping in the glorious Snowy Mountains. And I'd just like to say thanks, Steve and Patsy, for enhancing our life experiences. And my deepest thanks goes to Steve for being that all-important father figure to me. There's a side to Steve that only surfaced in a very few brief magical moments. He possessed an ever-lurking playful sense of humour that I, as an impressionable teenager, absorbed and found comfort and inspiration therein. Albeit myself possibly being the source of Steve's humour on occasion, it didn't matter, he was fun. Indeed, Steve would be howling with inimitable croaky belly laughs if I was right now discovering that the speech I had carefully folded and brought with me was in fact the grocery shopping list, with the overworked tome still sitting at home on the kitchen table. There's so many funny moments and beautiful moments, but just quickly, I remember as a 12-year-old in traffic once with Fiona and I on our way to yet another action-packed canoeing, walking, sailing weekend adventure. A car pulled up next to us containing a very unruly child passenger, and I then witnessed Steve making highly animated pufferfish faces at the shocked and bemused 6-year-old. We then drove off with the stunned infant in our rear vision mirror, no doubt still receiving therapy today. Steve was also known to gather the murky white froth from the swirling snowy river and then plaster it all over his beard to make an instant Santa. It's a canoeing memory. Look, despite his loud bark, Steve was the epitome of a humble and gentle man. So, thank you, Steve, for letting me see your gentle soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Neil. Ashley King, who is the son of one of Dad's great old Morwell Tech friends, Andrew King, and his wife Jan, are going to come and say a few words.
Hello everyone, my name's Ash, this is my mum Janet, and we're going to say a few things on behalf of my dad Andrew King and also mum as well. So Steve and Dad first came across each other at Morwell Tech, and it's there that Dad's memories of Steve begin. So Dad's written this speech for you. It's a little bit long, but I'll try and get through it as quickly as I can. Okay. On a hot February day in the far-off year of 1967, I first met Steve Craddock. I was 20 years old and about to begin what would turn out to be a 27-year secondary teaching career. My view of the world was about to go a number of reality checks, for life at Morwell Technical School would turn out to be rather different from the idealised picture with which I had first entered teacher training. The role of Steve Craddock in my transition from naive neophyte to hardened cynic should not be underestimated. I was struck immediately by the extraordinary presence of this person. Steve's height and build contributed to this. But it was something more, a quality that demanded one's attention, then, having gained it, rewarded his listeners with a mesmerising mixture of charm, intelligence, wit, and rudeness. Steve was a character among numerous characters on the Morwell Tech staff. It seems to me now that many of us were trying to forget our surroundings, to block out the facts which confronted us every day. We sought solace in our own company, particularly those within the humanities department, and found distractions from the daily drudgery of our working life. Of particular importance were the staff parties. Steve played a key role at most of these get-togethers. His voice, his laugh, was louder than anyone's, and he delighted in pouring scorn on the stupidity of the school administration. In particular, the vice principal. Although when confronted by this man, he appeared to be as intimidated as the rest of us, at staff parties, Steve would wait until about 10:30 or so, when the good residents of Morwell were abed, and then make his way to the back veranda, where he would yell at the top of his voice, "My name's Hal Percy and I don't care who knows it." It soon became evident to me that Steve was a man of contrasts. As far as I could see, he was either passionate about something or was totally disinterested. This meant that if you started a conversation with him, or if he had inadvertently joined in on one that had already started, you ran the risk that if the topic didn't suit him, Steve would walk away or perhaps change the subject. Steve was perhaps simply unable to pretend he was interested. The same trait seemed to apply to his relationships with other people. Either he was interested or he wasn't. If he wasn't interested in you or the topic of your conversation, Steve would not, perhaps could not, pretend. Although this probably means that he would not have made a very good politician, at the same time it implies to me that Steve was a painfully honest person. What you saw and heard was the real man, not someone pretending anything. This characteristic inevitably led people sometimes to the conclusion that Steve was rude, and he probably was, but I think on reflection that we should remember it as a demonstration of his irrepressible honesty. He could be unkind. On one occasion very early in the piece, I heard this happen and took him to task over it. Another first-year outer, like me, Margaret was finding Morwell Tech a little too raw for her tastes. In fact, I wondered why the department had sent her there. She didn't seem to have failed anything, and it was highly unlikely that she had committed some dreadful crime. Whatever the case, Margaret was having a tough time, and Steve made a nasty comment to her, implying that she should shut up and get on with it. Without thinking, I took Steve aside and told him to stop being such an insensitive, self-righteous pain in the ass, or something to that effect. I immediately wondered whether this was the end of our developing a relationship, but Steve swallowed his pride, mumbled, "Okay," and no more was said about it. In fact, I've always thought that our real friendship began in that moment. This wasn't the only occasion when Steve demonstrated that he could take it as well as dish it out. I had a perverse notion to enrol him in the Tall Women's Association, of which I could be a member, by the way. Enroll him in the Tall Women's Association, and when he received a letter from them, Steve came immediately to me wearing that unique grin and said, "You bastard," pleasantly. Now, the Morwell Tech staff room was absolutely dominated at recess and lunchtime by the antics of a small group of table tennis players. And Steve was among the rowdiest of them, leaping about while he shouted encouragement to his partner, waving his arms in a frenzy as he slashed right and left and crashing into the walls, tables and other staff members. The worst team combination was probably Craddock and Begg, whose never-ceasing vocal gymnastics were even more annoying than the physical. Oh, perilously close, Steve, perilously close. Perilously close, Peggy, perilously close. After dozens of repetitions of this kind of nonsense, the novelty wore off. Steve also demonstrated his sporting prowess on the volleyball court. The male staff decided to form a team, but in 2 seasons, we never won a match. I have a vivid picture in my mind of the team heaped in a pile of bodies in the middle of the court, with Steve sitting on top, looking vaguely around for the ball, which eventually came down on his head. It was in the classroom, of course, where another of Steve's special sporting skills found expression. It had been made quite clear to me during my first day at Morwell that in order to survive, I had to acquire a length of leather. We assembled in the Humanities Department office during a free period for my training in giving the cuts. Steve arranged a series of small pieces of chalk on the desk before him, then proceeded to smash them to smithereens with a series of well-aimed strokes. Swish, crack! One after the other. It was most impressive. We suddenly became aware that the Form 1 class in the adjoining room had become deathly silent. We took turns to peek through a hole which had been created for this purpose. A room full of bug-eyed, worried faces rewarded our interest. Steve grinned broadly at me. "Your turn," he whispered eagerly as he passed me the strap. Steve was not one of those rare teachers who enjoyed giving the strap, but he believed that if you were going to do it, you should do it properly. Steve was generous, not just in his willingness to turn me into a mad strapper, but in other ways too. After we both moved to Moorabbin Tech, I soon realised that Steve had enrolled at Monash Uni in an effort to improve his qualifications. He was full of enthusiasm for his new adventure and encouraged me to follow his example. Having had a miserable time at Melbourne Uni, I wouldn't have had a bar of the idea, but Steve persisted. And then our head of department, Noel Watkins, insisted. "Do politics," enthused Steve. "It's great. There's a guy named Max Techman who's brilliant." I was enrolled before I knew it. Then Steve discovered anthropology and successfully convinced me to join him. Over the next few years, with the aid of part-time study leave, both Steve and I completed our degrees, and his assistance and encouragement played no small part in my late-found academic success. Steve's generosity and enthusiasm was infectious, and he convinced John Rudolph and me to join him and Pat on several outdoor adventures. A bushwalk into the high country where we stayed overnight in Lovett's hut seemed like a high adventure to me at the time and sparked in me with a love of this kind of activity which has been passed on to all of our children and now our grandchildren. My first canoeing experience with the Craddocks was almost a disaster, culminating in a swim in the flooded... Just distracted by my old man as a younger man. A swim in the flooded, freezing waters of the Yarra, and what seemed like hours clinging numbly to a branch of a tree with Pat, who was pregnant with Alison at the time, while we tried to summon the strength and the will to save ourselves. Other less dramatic canoeing adventures followed, one of them at least with young Rudolph as my paddling companion. I hasten to add, however, that Steve never convinced me to participate in his rock climbing adventures. The generosity of the Craddocks was expressed to me and members of my family on numerous occasions over the following 40 years. Having discovered desktop publishing and half convinced that I could make a go of it, I was delighted to discover that Steve and Pat had already taken the same plunge. Looking back, I suspect that I may have come close, perilously close, to wearing out my welcome on occasions, as I was a frequent visitor to the offices of penfolk. But if they were sick of the sight of me, they never showed it. Without the support and encouragement of the Craddocks, Tailfeather Publishing would have never existed. So now, So now, after threatening to leave us on numerous occasions over the however many years, Steve has gone. It's hard to believe. I guess I don't want to believe it. Perhaps if he'd been one of those people who never shut up about their ailments and operations, Steve's departure might have been easier to expect. But of course, he didn't. He wasn't. He would talk about this side of his life, especially if there was something he thought you might find interesting. But on the whole, he followed the same principles by which he conducted all of his friendships. He wasn't about to pretend that he thought you might be interested, and he didn't expect you to pretend that you were. He would rather move the topic of conversation onto something that he really found interesting. And whatever it was invariably interesting. And of course, Steve's emails were just like this too. In fact, Steve's emails would make quite an entertaining book. Always interesting, always full of enthusiasm and humour, always being critical of the things that deserve to be criticised, but supportive of those things that were worthy of encouragement. They were sometimes a little too honest to be called polite, but they were never hypocritical or insincere. They were rich and full of life, and I miss them already. They were Steve Craddock to a T. Andrew King, 2017.
Hello, I'm Janet, Andrew's wife. Upon returning from a family holiday, Andrew checked his emails and read the sad news of Steve's death. He sat there sobbing with his head cradled in his hands. He wishes very much that he could be here today. He has sent a poem for me to read out, but just before I do, I'd just like to say just a few words of my own. It seems a long time since a very idealistic Andrew, aged 20, set out teaching and first met Steve at Morwell Tech. Andrew was very impressed, if not just a trifle awestricken. I was a naive little 20-year-old wife and mother. I didn't know what I'd struck. I was in very fear of this tall, formidable man. I thought he had a loud, brazen voice, colourful language, a cheeky grin, sometimes spoke unkindly, had a sometimes cruel and wicked sense of humour, was forthright, matter-of-fact, straight to the point, and would not just suffer fools gladly, but wouldn't suffer them at all. But Steve had a colourful and positive personality, and over time I learned that underneath all this was really a kind and deeply caring human being, one who, when beaten, would concede defeat graciously. Also, he really was interested in other people. I remember being impressed one day years ago when Steve rang me up to congratulate me on having a letter published as Letter of the Day in The Age. His call meant so much to me. Steve was also very generous. I am forever grateful to him for lending Andrew $50 back in 1969, a lot then. The Education Department for 9 months had neglected to pay Andrew his due pay rise, and we were skint. Steve saved the day. Andrew bought an electric organ, joined a band, and earned some much-needed money. Steve's generosity continued in practical ways and in the giving and sharing of his expertise, advice, help, support, and sincere friendship. Our 4 children also grieved Steve's passing. They each hold fond memories of unique experiences, like being interrogated by Steve from babyhood to check their intellect, being chained alongside Alison to the railing of Steve and Pat's yacht, chained like dogs so they wouldn't fall overboard. They remember fondly Steve and Pat's lovely whippets, Huey and Grace. Consequently, Ash and his wife now have a lovely whippet of their own. Steve was an excellent teacher, but outside the classroom, it seemed very much to us that he had little time for other people's children. So we were amazed, shocked even, when Steve said, "Your son, he barracks for Hawthorn. Would he like to go to the Hawks Kangaroos match with me?" Well, equally shocked was Steve when young little Ash turned up with me imploring, "Please don't let him go to the toilet by himself, Steve." Oh, Steve turned ghastly white. I thought I was going with the much older one. Then Steve muttered, all right, won't matter. So off they both went to the footy. "Gee, he knows a lot about footy," said Steve on their return. "He knows all about each player's age, height, weight, and all their vital statistics." I think they both enjoyed the day. Steve certainly did learn a lot. There could not possibly be anybody anywhere like our Steve Craddock. So I'd like to now read Andrew's poem, written first for Steve's 70th birthday, but now extended with much, much fondness. I think I'll have to take it down here. Thanks. In 67, I was sent, with what courage I could rally, to start a life with child and wife deep in the Latrobe Valley. To Morwell Tech I found my way, and there amongst field and paddocks I met a bloke, and 'tis no joke, the boys called him Craddock. He stood a foot above the crowd, his voice was loud and brassy, and when he walked into a room the students' eyes went glassy. He had a way of taming boys, no matter what the weather. He'd quell the riot, stop the noise, with just a strip of leather. He worked right through his recess times at ping pong, so persistent, and volleyball, he joined a team whose performance was consistent. Now Stephen C. was unafraid, he'd show nobody mercy, although he'd sometimes go quite pale when questioned by Hal Percy. But when Steve had been fortified by flasks of liquid amber, he'd yell out insults to the boss while on the back veranda. Well read, well oiled, Steve was a prince. He even kept a donkey. But give him half a glass of beer, his judgment might go wonky. One night while Crash was with his wife, the Morwell nightlife trying, a chair leg in his riding boot sent some poor fellow flying. A loud tie competition started up. Ash is wearing the winning tie. "'Twixt me and four," said Stephen, and Flowerpie knew no bounds. The contest, it was even. One day I wore a floral tie, a truly ghastly thing. The boys cried, "Crash, you've lost the comp. That's a grass tie, Mr. King." The years went by and Steve moved on at A.N. Watkins' bidding. He lived with Pat in charming Court Moorabbin, I'm not kidding. He hadn't lost his patient ways, his famous tact and charm, and sometimes at Moorabbin Tech he'd exercise his arm. He went to Monash, did a course, earned accolades and glory. He moved to Brunswick, built a yacht, but that's another story. As Steve climbed rocks and walked apace through vales and narrow passes, and then one Monday morn he failed to turn up for his classes. "Where is our Crash?" the lads all cried. The principal went spastic. There was despair amongst the staff, and the news was looking drastic. Then young Johnny Rudolph spoke. "I heard the Craddocks talking. Despite the snow this last weekend, our Pat and Steve went walking." And so a national search began. It cost how much? A bargain. They found the Craddocks resting up inside their green Volkswagen. Another day, our Stephen said, "You should join us canoeing. It's rather good and much more fun than other stuff you're doing." So one cold and wintry day, I joined the favourites Craddock upon a stream at Yarra Glen, mid cows and fields and paddocks. The river's banks were running high. The water, it was chilly. But did we stop to ask ourselves, ain't this a trifle silly? No, 'twas no time for yellow streaks nor lily-coloured liver, and so we plunged inside our boat into the surging river. We rushed along, but so it seemed, just like junket through a funnel, and soon beheld a gaping maw, the dreaded Pound Bend Tunnel. "Fear not," our gallant captain cried, but all the crew were praying and didn't see or hear or care what Stephen had been saying. We closed our eyes and gripped the sides with fearful expectation. Then down the chute and out the end, a dire ejaculation. The end was near, all hope was lost. The flood would give no quarter, for soon the rapids proved too much and tipped us in the water. I found myself, and Patsy too, gripped tightly to a willow, but of the captain, not a sign. We'd lost him in the billow. But all that ends well, Shakespeare said, is likely to seem rosy, and later on, when Steve turned up, the day turned out quite cosy. The three adventurers warmed up beside a neighbour's fire, and pretty soon we laughed and joked about our trip so dire. I think I've almost said enough about our good friend Stephen. He was unique, there is no doubt. I think the verdict's even. No time for insincerity, or those with views myopic. And if he wasn't interested, he'd simply change the topic. He could be rude and sometimes cruel, but through it, managed even to make us laugh and sometimes cry. I won't forget you, Stephen. I've used my quota, should desist. It's time to feed my haddock, the only word that rhymes, I fear. A toast to you, Steve Craddock. With love from Andrew and the rest of us. Thank you, Steve. Thanks.
So, John Martin. There's some random pictures here.
Oh, yeah, must be something interesting.
Feel free to just push that to
You do that one?
Yeah.
My name's John Martin, and
How's that?
my name's John Martin, and it appears on the last relic of the Hastings Yacht Club. My first contact with Steve was in the early 1970s at Hastings Yacht Club. My parents and I were new members, and Steve was discussing my father's intention to buy a larger trailer sailor. Being told how much it would cost, Steve exclaimed, "What? You can buy a proper yacht with that?" Quickly accepting you can't win an argument with Steve, my father abandoned his original plan and purchased a small keelboat. So began my long friendship with Steve. During the sailing years, we raced against Scarab many times, allowing us to become intimately acquainted with her stern and little else. She was a well-sailed yacht with Pat and Allison as crew. Steve developed a knack of always claiming right-of-way and tacking duels, even if he didn't have it. But each of the crew knew their duty. There's no better illustrated than a night at Flinders Jetty in the sudden change of weather. A strong wind, a large swell rolling through the jetty. My dominant memory of that unpleasant night was Steve standing in a cockpit barking orders into the darkness. Close inspection revealed Pat in the water, swimming, mooring line in hand, securing Scarab against the elements. Truly a masterclass in management best practice. Steve, Pat and Allison sailed that little boat on numerous cruises around Bass Strait, always to return safely, even though sometimes a little navigationally embarrassed. When your destination is King Island and you make landfall at Apollo Bay, it is a valuable lesson to read the instructions before using new technology. After years of sailing, Steve and Pat returned to their land-based pursuits. Steve, always happy to share his knowledge and experience, provided me with valuable advice and encouragement during my formative bushwalking period. This generosity was later extended to rock climbing, then cross-country skiing. I have fond memories of the trip we did: the high country, Mount Bogong, Christmas at the Walls of Jerusalem, the South Coast track, the very wet Western Arthur's trip, and Steve and Tony hiding rocks in each other's packs. Countless weekends camping and climbing at the Grampians and Arapalis. When I talk of and remember Steve, I cannot separate in my mind Steve and Pat. Inseparable, supportive and unbreakable. Pat was the rock upon which Steve stood. Steve's sudden passing was a shock, but I was comforted in a strange way, knowing it was on his terms. Typical Steve, always in control and right to the end. Steve has been a good friend over many years. It is a privilege and a pleasure to have known him. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome the lovely Heather Lacey to the stage. It's a very great honour and privilege to be speaking about Steve today. My friendship with comrade Steve, a truly remarkable human being, began in 1977 when I commenced a teaching position at Jordanville Tech in Ashwood. Steve was my head of humanities and so was technically my boss, although I don't think he ever told me what to do. My memories of Steve the teacher are of a kind and generous leader, a passionate and committed unionist, and a man full of empathy and devotion to empower the Housing Commission boys we were privileged to teach there. While colleagues together at Jordanville, a strong friendship developed between Steve and Pat and I and my dear late husband Paul. Once Steve and Pat could bring themselves to admit that they were no longer the socialists that they had long purported to be, they moved out of their Brunswick terrace and bought their house in Arthur Street, Ashwood. This was a remarkable development as they went on to truly love home ownership. Paul and I soon became regular dinner guests at Arthur Street, partaking of Steve's amazing culinary skills, marvelling at Steve's self-built, state-of-the-art, of course, mud brick shed, and his wonderfully designed tiered deck. Many a passionate political and philosophical discussion took place on that deck in late summer afternoons in Arthur Street. I didn't stay long at Jordanville, but Paul's and my friendship with Steve and Pat flourished and endured until the very end. When Steve had closed the book on his teaching career, it coincided with the growth of Paul's consultancy business. Paul saw an opportunity to utilise Steve's superior writing skills in his business, and Steve became a critical partner in the success of Paul's sport and recreation consultancy. Concurrently, Steve and Pat set up Penfolk Publishing, a business that produced and edited books, family histories, and much, much more. A hugely successful enterprise that they sold when they moved to Bowen Heads in 1997. Steve and my husband Paul went deep. I suspect that many a working hour was spent not on writing work, but with Steve and Paul ruminating about inequality, hypocrisy, sport, books, and of course the meaning of life. It was Paul, along with Steve's cardiologist, who talked Steve and Pat into buying 92 Carr Street in 1997 and moving to Bowen Heads. Steve and Pat took to Bowen Heads like fish to water. They had the perfect setup with their two houses at Carr Street, enjoying their new home at the front and allowing Alison and Andy a separate house when they visited, and also affording their siblings and friends such as Charles Smith and me to visit and enjoy their hospitality. They loved the river and the possibilities it gave for canoeing and walking. Who can forget the canoe that Steve built himself? They made many enduring friendships and revelled in the civic activism of the town. And what a difference Steve made to Bowen Heads. From early on, Steve was active in the Bowen Heads Association. He was also an influential committee member
of the Barwon Coast Committee of Management. On the Coast Committee, he was inspired by the leadership of Bob Jordan, whose integrity and insight he greatly admired. Through these organisations, Steve met and befriended many like-minded Barwon Heads residents who appreciated his preparedness to roll up his sleeves and agitate for the community he came to love so much. The various bureaucracies he railed against were well and truly kept on their toes by our Steve. Steve's Time and Tide columns, already mentioned today, but I can't help but talk about them, in the community magazine Talking Heads, chronicle the development and growth and life of Barwon Heads from 2004. I have read dozens and dozens of Steve's old articles and blogs over the past week, and what a joy it has been. Time and Tide gave readers insight into local legends like Bonnie Cameron, pressing issues like the Barwon Heads Bridge, the Barwon Heads Bridge to nowhere, the kindergarten, Armstrong Creek, and the disconnect between development and infrastructure. He regularly gave the City of Greater Geelong a fair bit of stick. Time and Tide could be controversial, but equally it could provide the reader with wonderful local knowledge, such as his 2010 piece on the beauty and tranquillity of the Edwards Point Walk at St Leonard's. I was lucky enough to be taken there by Steve and Pat, and I remember the days so clearly. He even ran to holiday quizzes about Barwon Heads. I'm sure that I wasn't alone, in that Time and Tide was the first page I turned to when I picked up my monthly copy of Talking Heads. These columns, along with his writings in Barwon and beyond, reveal Steve's love of life, but more than that, his generosity in that he thought it was the most natural thing in the world to write so that others could share his love of the outdoors and the environment and his passion for the big issues. His love of reading led him to set up, with the help of Alison, the Shelf Life blog of his and others' book reviews. Already also mentioned today, Shelf Life became an invaluable guide for his friends in choosing what books to read, and the Shelf Life reviews were pretty good too. I hope that somehow those of us who are left can continue what Steve has left us with Shelf Life. And who can forget the absolute joy Steve got from his almost daily visits to the Barwon Heads Bridge building site in 2009 and 10. Even though he railed against the decision to build the new bridge in the original location, he became fascinated with the progress and technology of the new bridge's building works. He and I had had many an argument over the bridge, and so I was delighted when he got over it, well, mostly. And he would often pop in to regale us about the various wonders of the new bridge. Somewhere, there would be an amazing record of the building of our bridge, as Steve took photos almost daily of the works. No doubt the engineers and bridge workers marvelled at his curiosity. I marvelled at his generosity of spirit in that he could get over his anger about the bridge and move on. Similar, but more personal, was his rejoicing of my new relationship and marriage to my wonderful husband David Russell 10 years ago, God forbid at the Barwon Heads Golf Club. Subsequently, David and I have bought a holiday house here in Barwon Heads, enabling us to see much more of Steve and Pat. There's no easy way to end a speech about Steve Craddock. He died having given life a bloody good crack. He was complex, infinitely interesting, and bright beyond belief. For the last 10 years or so, he and I would regularly exchange emails about political machinations everywhere, the Middle East and the USA in particular. His ability to find riveting materials that just begged to be read and discussed was second to none. I still look for his emails in my inbox. But in a way, I'm glad he hasn't had to witness the first 2 weeks of the Trump regime. But what great email discussions we would have had about Steve Bannon, the new Prince of Darkness. We had been working on creating a stronger word than gobsmacking in relation to all in the world of Trump. There were many things that Steve railed against, such as privilege, inequality, government inefficiency, how he hated what Centrelink had become, the Barwon Heads Golf Club, and David, my son Evan and I are members, the plight of the Palestinians and Brexit, amongst others, of course. But most of all, he railed against the incessant pain he had to endure because of the effects of the very rare Marfan syndrome that for many years had ravaged his body. He was indeed a very brave man. But Steve did not let any of these negatives beat him. His many joys and passions dominated his life. Joys such as his writing, the outdoors, bushwalking, rock climbing, his many friends, foremost being the ever-loyal Anthony. His and Pat's sailing boat that we've heard about that was moored at Hastings, the Scarab. Mastering and keeping up with technology. Annabelle Crabb, not only for a kitchen cabinet show, his travels in which he discovered a love of France and the Orkney Islands in Scotland. Cycling and watching the Tour de France. The dogs, Huey and Gracie. AFL football and the North Melbourne Football Club, courtesy of Bruce Hannon, an old colleague of ours at Jordanville Tech. Movies, books, Netflix, and always politics. He was someone who had to get to the bottom of anything that took his interest. He was an expert about a lot of things. All these passions, and there are probably more that I've failed to mention, are not bad for a man who took a daily dose of warfarin and endured open heart surgery pretty much every 2 years. But, above all, his greatest joy was his love and devotion to his beloved wife, Pat, his incredible partner in everything he ever did in life, and his pride and love for his precious daughter, Alison, and her husband, Andy. His loves and passions sustained him and enabled him to endure to the very end. My son, Evan, who is here today, sent me this text when I told my 3 children of Steve's death. Very sorry to hear of Steve's passing. He was a great and loyal friend of yours and Dad's, and a very interesting and passionate person. Even in recent years, when his health had been failing him, Steve was full of life, engaged and engaging. Personally, I always enjoyed conversation with him, and his tolerance, perhaps even grudging respect for my political views. I will miss his presence in our family's life very much. I'm sure that, along with me, all of you will miss him too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. Where's Pete Smith? There he is, the man himself.
Today is a celebration of Steve's life with us, and there is much to celebrate. I'd like to share in 2 aspects of Steve's vast experiences, the particularly early days of rock climbing and kayaking at the Snowy River. Steve was an unforgettable character. His character is written in his face, recorded in his voice, always a twinkle in the eye, a booming laugh, and a wry smile when he caught you at a gotcha moment, which he got me quite a few times. My memories of his larger-than-life character are his absolutely infectious enthusiasm, an exploratory zeal. He was very persuasive, and bravery was an element of his life throughout. Actually, I haven't included rudeness in my characteristics because Steve told me the last time that I met him that I was the rudest person he'd ever met. Steve was a born teacher and had a knack and enthusiasm for passing on his interests and skills. He has enriched generations with a love of the outdoors, as is testified by our children and grandchildren being active, some to the elite level. These elements permeated all of his activities, not the least rock climbing and Snowy River. I'll start with rock climbing because that's where I first met Steve and his dad Bob at the VCC, the Victorian Climbing Club. Bob and Steve were a close-knit team in climbing and made a massive contribution to the early VCC, and that continued until Bob's untimely tragic accident whilst involved in a climbing course. They brought a solid British approach to climbing, where you didn't ever climb anything that you couldn't reverse. Well, Jeff Shaw just put it another way when he told me he'd never fallen off, that you didn't attempt to do anything you couldn't climb. But Steve was one of those unique climbers. He didn't ever fall off in a long climbing career. Steve's arrival at the VCC was nearly coincidental with Peter Jackson, John Fay and young Dewhurst and Baxter. They transformed a fairly little group of climbers, and our meetings became full of debate and new methods and materials. Standards were raised, guidebooks appeared to the popular crags. Steve was an enthusiastic promoter in all these developments. Steve always had a love of books, and he started and maintained a top-class library of climbing books to spur members' interests in the climbing world. I remember the buzz of a meeting in 1963 when Steve and Bob and Peter Jackson were brimming with excitement about a new crag at Mount Arapiles. A determined expedition was launched. Bob and Steve, Greg and Peter Jackson and Doug Angus put up the first routes, with Steve and Greg putting up Tiptoe Ridge, which is a world classic, and Siren. So this trip began a saga of world-class climbing and blossoming of a pioneering partnership of Greg and Steve as a climbing team. Steve had an enduring affection for those early climbs, oft repeated, and amongst many new routes. Now, history puts a focus on Arapiles for Steve, but in reality, he was active on all the crags. He was always reactive. Early days at Sugarloaf, Jawbones, Rosier, Mount Difficult, Stapleton, he was always on the lookout for the perfect crag. He loved climbing and all that went with it. I'll use his own words, which I just read before. For 40, 50 years, rock was my obsession. The search for the hold, the move, the line, the cliff, the range, the unnamed crag. Learning the craft, Woolamai, Sugarloaf, Jawbones, then Arapiles, Stapleton, Mount Difficult, and on and on. The last time we met with Steve, he showed us with pride and enjoyment he and Greg's part in a documentary on Arapiles. These two talented pioneers have done their last climb. Steve has led the last pitch, where the belays come in pairs. Steve's exploratory zeal led him to another iconic place in our lives, Snowy River. Indeed, Steve was the founding father of the Snowy River mob, and I think that makes Pat the founding mother. A bit like Arapiles, Pat and Steve had discovered the kayaking potential of the Snowy River. Having paddled through the big system, he persuaded the mob to come to Snowy and run its waters. Thus was born the Snowy mob, who still run strong and continue the Snowy traditions, as they will again at Easter this year. Again, Steve was a leader in passing on kayaking skills applied on many a trip down the Snowy, sometimes idyllic, sometimes terrifying. Campfire yarns heightened the mysteries of Snowy River, being munched in the island rapid, or the washing machine, or God forbid, the big system. The green machine folded up in the big system, but the yellow, Steve's machine, always came through. And there was Greg in the red, and we don't ever mention Bernie's black machine. The campfires were legendary. The singing, the stories, the fire walking. Steve with his flagon of port and peanut butter jar glass. The songs. Steve loved Australian bush ballads and led us through the Wild West show to the Drover's Dream, a rousing Rule Britannia, and the recital of the Bastard from the Bush. And then Pat would melt our hearts with a nightingale in Berkeley Square. Steve's character was displayed to the full at Snowy River. On one occasion, he bravely rescued a stranded canoeist in distress at the height of a big flood. A daring rescue, he managed to persuade a guy clinging to a tree to let go and commit his life to Steve hanging onto the back of his canoe, which he then ferry glided across the torrent back to safety. Campsite duffing was an annual sport at Snowy, but some sites were sacrosanct. Steve had worked on his for years, building a base of soft fern fronds. I remember Steve's effusive thanks to Tony, who tried to help by putting his tent on hallowed ground. Ah, yes, I remember it well. An example of Steve's patience and forbearance were displayed when preparing for the trip home. Steve had packed the Subaru to the ceiling with meticulous care. As we travelled with the family to say goodbye, he reached for the key. The key. Patiently, Steve unpacked the whole car. Alison was watching from behind a tree. The key eventually located, the car repacked, and away they sped. I remember it well. Steve's legacy to the outdoor world is considerable. Through climbing courses, passing on his considerable skills in outdoor activities, and hosts of people have become expert in climbing, kayaking, cross-country skiing, and have reached lifelong enjoyment of the nature and outdoors. We give thanks for his legendary character and will sadly miss his presence, although I feel it's right here now. Thank you. I could not let the day pass without a toast with a glass of red to Steve and to the mother of Snowy River.
So, Damien, one of my brothers from another mother. I can't really pull that off, can I? I tried.
Oh, look at you.
Got my apple here, ready to go.
Dad would be proud. It'd probably fall off there.
Gee whiz, that's one. Thanks, Alison. Hi, everyone. For those that don't know me, my name's Damien Lovejoy. I'm part of that Snowy crew that Peter was referring to just before. I just want to spend
very.
Thanks. I just want to spend a couple of minutes describing to you who Steve was as perceived through my eyes. And this differs in some ways to the lovely thoughts that others have had about the man. Mainly because, unlike you, during my formative years, Steve wasn't really a friend of mine. In fact, he was far more like a second father. Just as Pat was a second mother and Alison a sister. Actually, this was one of the terrific parts of my childhood that I loved so much. I have been so lucky to have so much love around me, not only from my biological parents, thank you, but also from many other snowy parents. Many brothers and sisters who are here, some who aren't, that have meant so much to me over my life. And whilst we have been separated for long periods of time and distance, none of you have ever really been very far from me during my walk on this planet. So Steve, so other than my lovely mum and dad, thank you, few people have had a bigger influence on my growing up than Steve and Pat, and I think, Peter, you made that point really well. There's so much has rubbed off. The reason for this is because my mum and dad, with being such great friends with Steve and Pat and them as teachers, Steve and Pat were able to take me away often on holidays when my parents had to work. So I was therefore lucky enough to be a common feature in their lives as a young fella. Either going away with my parents and the Craddocks, or sometimes just on wonderful adventures alongside Alison and Steve and Pat. Bushwalking trips, these things have been talked about. Car touring, climbing, skiing. It really felt like we just about did it all. It was great. But like I said, because we're on a lot of family holidays with Steve and Pat, we really were like a second set of parents and did all the things that parents do. Steve's parenting style for me was to treat me pretty much the same as Alison. And I remember being at the receiving end of some timely discipline on occasion, when it was sorely needed, I think. Actually, he wasn't the only snowy parent that I had. In fact, there's some here now that doled out some discipline, some love, some generosity, and that communal parenting, which is I think so important, and really important these days as well. Anyway, in this way, I remember Steve as a giant of a man. I can picture him right now, me as a young kid, looking way up high at his dangerously smiling face, wondering what was about to come out of his mouth and whether it was going to be directed at me. Hopefully not, but sometimes it was. I was daunted by the knowledge that Steve had, as were others that I've learned today. He knew so much about climbing and camping and sailing. He did so much, and he combined this with a razor-sharp intellect that was, for me, fascinating, despite not always, as a young kid, understanding everything that was being said or sung. As a kid, I think understanding everything was secondary to the keen ambience of the moment that was created by Steve and the other cronies of his ilk, many of them who are here today. An ambience that was generally enhanced by the atmosphere of crackling wood in the bonfire, a yellow hue in the atmosphere, and the contentment of being exactly where I wanted to be. It's almost like a dream that I remember of Steve walking and singing in the area between the circle of the fire, where people were, and where the fire itself was. Embers whizzing around as one of the giant logs that Peter Smith had rescued from its lonely fate in the snowy mountains settled into its glorious fiery end. But I don't know if he would appreciate that. I mean, but the memory of that is very special to me, very special indeed, and including great lessons, such as great songs that still ring in my head to this day. Here's to the pine pot, barley mum. My eyes are dim, I cannot see. I did not bring my specs with me. And of course, the court of King Caractacus. And I always loved hearing about the ladies of the harem. It was just in my mind. I also learned a lot of colourful language around that fire. So there was lots of lessons in there. But most important of all of the lessons was the enduring friendship and respect that these guys had for each other It is, and it was, just beautiful. Now, Steve is no longer with us in this world, and that's a great loss for us all. And for many of us, Snowy kids, certainly for me, I feel a vital part of the foundation from which I was grown has also gone. Just knowing that he was down here in Bowen Heads with Pat gave me a sense, an unconscious sense, that everything was right in the world, in this part of the world. And sadly, that is no longer the case, and it's a reminder to me of just how important he was, and that I wish I had often let him know, more often. So friends, the last lesson Steve was to give me was to make sure that all you special folk who helped me make who I am today should know just how much you mean to me, indeed to us all. So I expect a knock on your door, Snowy family, so we can share one of life's most precious treasures, time.
My other brother, Michael.
Big hanky. Industrial size. Hello, I'm Michael Lyons. And I just want to tell you a bit of a story of my life with Steve. It's at this point that I really hate Damien. I've been jealous of him my entire life. He always had the best toys, and I always wanted everything he had. And right now I wish I'd finished my speech just like he has. He said so well, so clearly, just how much Steve was a father to us. In mine, it was a different time and in different ways, but a father no less. My father, Bern, sent through an email describing his first meeting with Steve as a young 17-year-old with the VCC and watching his progression into a mature explorer and leader in whatever area he decided to explore. We are his children, and we got the benefit of his passion for exploration, not in a selfish desire to explore, but a passion to share with others, the Snowy being a prime example of this. His legacy for me is simple yet incredibly profound, for it defined who I've become as an adult. But it's at this point that I have to pause, because to talk of Steve in my life is to talk of Pat as well. To talk of one without the other is like talking about yin without its yang, its laurel without its hardy. You can choose which is which. With the notable exception of one trip, which was notable by the absence of Pat, and I'll go into that in a moment, it is both their involvement in my life that changed and helped me become the person I am today. We had many trips, Alice and Steve, Pat and I, climbing and generally exploring during the summer and winter holidays. These occurring primarily after I'd come back from the UK and Dad was working, so it was just the four of us. They truly looked after me. The many Barbie battles I had with Alison would no doubt have put off Barbies for life. I seem to remember once threatening to bring my tank next time we played. But it's their nurturing of my writing that is the first profound gift they gave me. As a young man, I found the act and art of reading and writing a torture. I would be in my 20s diagnosed with dyslexia. Their quiet assurance that I should keep a journal of our adventures and their kind, careful help in making it legible introduced me to an art form that has become my career. Here is one of the many journals I keep and have kept from those times. I cannot thank Steve, but I can thank you.
Their second gift to me was the multi-day explorations of some of Australia's most wondrous areas. 7 days wandering around the Murchison Range of Tasmania with all the weather that Tassie blesses us with. To hear Steve moan and groan about the weather ad nauseum, only to sing out with Cliff Richard's We're on a Summer Holiday a little while later. It shows the imperfect, flawed, wonderful, beautiful man that he was. Our next adventure was skiing in the main range, and it is here that we truly see Pat's gift. On all our other trips, no matter the length or weather, some treat would appear, making something wonderful extraordinary. Cheesecakes in Tasmania with Drambuie. Our one trip without her, and we had no toilet paper for a week. My journal that I kept records the pain and agony of trying to use snow and ice as toilet paper. Waking up with a gale blowing the tent almost down and Steve going, "Michael, wake up," and me saying, "Are we okay?" Him going, "Yes," and me promptly falling back to sleep. It shows the trust I had in him. My final trip with them was a 10-day trip through the northern plains and mountains of the Snowy Mountains. A graduation, if you will. My journal records my evolution from a bumbling teenager into a maturing bumbling teenager. But the joy of being on the journey became a professional focus as an outdoor teacher for 20 years. However, their role as parents has continued. Their advice to me when I decided to become a teacher was insightful and has continued to help me make wise decisions as a teacher. Pat's role with my daughter, inspiring with her art, continues to this day. There are no deeds that can ever repay the debt that I owe them, no words that can ever express my thanks. I'd like to finish off with a few words from my father, who's in England at the moment. I hold a deep feeling of gratitude for his and Pat's role in taking Michael under his wing during my absences overseas. Steve had many interests in his life and pursued them all with a higher level of excellence. He will long be remembered and loved as a remarkable and outstanding friend. Goodbye, Father, mentor, friend.
We saved the best for last.
What a lot of people. I'm well aware that we've gone well over time, so I'll try and be brief. Well, as some of you know already, Steve and I met in Morwell, Gippsland. Since the death of my father, my mother was finding it increasingly hard to make ends meet in England. So I gave up my college course where I was training to be an art teacher, and we migrated to Australia in 1963 on the £10 scheme. After doing a number of different office jobs, I was urged by a friend to see if I could get a teaching post. They accepted me right away. You must understand that in the early 60s, the Education Department of Victoria was so short of graduates that they were putting any warm-blooded, vaguely human being in front of classes. So to have somebody with teacher training, albeit half-finished teacher training, was like gold. And so I got sent to Morwell High School as a temporary teacher. I recall clearly the first time I saw Steve. I went to the Tech for a night class in life drawing run by the Tech School art teacher, Trish Cuss. We walked by an empty classroom from which wafted music. He was walking up and down between the desks, conducting Mozart, which he was playing on the school record player. He was tall and slender, dressed in a baggy black jumper, had heavy black rimmed glasses and a mop of dark brown hair, which fell fetchingly over one eye. I watched, fascinated by his long, thin fingers as he conducted the music. "That's Steve Craddock," said Trish. "He's a rock climber." I was surprised. He looked too thin and delicate for such a rough, in my ignorance, I imagined rock climbing to be. But he had precisely the intellectual, bookish good looks that I found attractive. And so I was very glad when he looked into Trish's office where we were having a cup of tea after the class. Trish introduced him, and I'll swear, he clicked his heels and kissed my hand. I was quite bowled over. The next time I saw him was on one rainy morning. I was walking to school. He came by in his battered old Holden and offered me a lift. It turns out he was just waiting for it to rain one day so he could ask me to share the bench seat. And all I could see of him was his toothy grin, and I got in. He has written about this strategy in a poem which I will read out to you in a moment. But I do need to give you another bit of background. In 2009, we went to Scotland for Alison and Andy's wedding. After the wedding, we drove up to the north of Scotland and took the ferry to the Orkney Islands. We marvelled at the antiquities, travelled all over the mainland, and visited by ferry some of the other islands. We had an absolutely splendid time, and while we were there, we visited a local jeweller, the world-famous Sheila Fleet. I already had quite a collection of her jewellery, and I bought some more earrings at her workshop. A couple of years later, Steve, always the sentimentalist, as a surprise gift, bought 2 Sheila Fleet rings, one for me and one for himself, which featured Celtic knots. I wear this ring now, as my original engagement ring has worn thin with 50 years of washing up and general housework. Here then is the poem he wrote, which intertwines these 2 themes. Celtic knots. Love started one morning in 1965 along McDonald Street, between the YMCA pool and the high school. Hair in a tight bob pinched forward past her ears like Cilla Black's. Pat strode towards work, her satchel swinging. One day, I knew it would be raining. And it was. She took the Holden lift and love started. We were children then, at least I was. But it rained, and she was beautiful. And love started. Orkney is the place for Celtic swells, for gold and silver hoard and more. No time needed though to pick the code. The swelling dots express devotion, and gold and silver lasts, and sometimes love and love does not. But somehow ours has. Our Celtic swirl caught tight, and then one our path swirled on. For years on crags, at sea, on land and snow, our twirl continued. Sometimes knots entangled and sometimes snap, but ours did not. Love started in McDonald Street one day when it rained. A footnote in the periodic table of relationships. Long-lasting love like gold and silver, outliving us, our daughter, our treasure. Thank you. That concludes the speeches, and we're going to play his favourite song with a few appropriate images for you to have a bit of quiet reflection about Steve.
In the chilly hours and minutes of uncertainty, I want to be in the warm hold of your love and mine, to feel you all around me and to take your hand along the sand. But I may as well try and catch the wind. When sundown pales the sky, I want to hide a while behind your smile, and everywhere I'd look, your eyes I'd find. For me to love you now would be the sweetest thing. 'Twould make me sing. But I may as well try and catch the wind. When rain has hung the leaves with tears, I want you near to kill my fears, to help me to leave all my blues behind. For standing in your heart is where I want to be and long to be. But I may as well try and catch the wind. But I may as well try